All right, today we're going to trace the journey of a single, really powerful idea that spans 350 years. We're talking about the Quaker belief in equality and how it, no joke, completely reshaped our world. And it all kicks off with one simple but totally revolutionary question.
So everything, and I mean everything, starts with this one question. You have to remember, back in the 1600s, just asking this question was a huge act of rebellion. But for the very first Quakers, the answer they came up with, well, it became the foundation for a spiritual and social revolution.
Their answer was this concept they called the inward light. And look, this wasn't just some fuzzy, feel-good idea. No, it was a core belief, a real doctrine, that a piece of God, a divine spark, exists in every single person. Not just the king, not just the priests, not just men, but literally everyone. You got to get this, because this one idea is the engine that drives the entire story we're telling today.
To really get just how radical this was, you have to picture the world they were living in. I mean, society was a strict pyramid. You had God at the top, then the king, then the nobles, and way down at the bottom, everybody else. Authority just flowed downwards. The Quakers, they looked at that and said, nope. They completely rejected it. They argued that divine authority wasn't top-down at all. It was horizontal. It was spread out, found equally inside every single person.
So, okay, how does a belief, an idea about God, actually spark a full-blown social rebellion? Well, it doesn't start with big speeches or grand declarations. It starts with small, defiant, everyday actions.
These early Quakers, they just refused to play the social game. For example, they'd use the informal words thee and thou with everyone, from a servant right up to a judge. And back then, that was a huge insult to the powerful. They also wouldn't take their hats off to nobles. And these weren't just weird habits. They were public statements, basically shouting that in God's eyes, your fancy title means absolutely nothing.
And the very first, most direct place this idea was applied? Equality for women. Think about it. If that divine light is in everyone, well, then it has to be in women too. And that simple fact gave them a kind of spiritual authority that was just unheard of at the time. The intellectual powerhouse behind this was a woman named Margaret Fell. In 1666, she drops this absolute bombshell of a pamphlet called Women's Speaking Justified. And in it, she uses the Bible itself to argue that women had the right to preach. You got to understand, this was something forbidden by pretty much every other Christian group out there.
And her logic was just so sharp, so simple. She basically said, hey, let's look at the story. Who were the very first people to see and announce that Jesus was resurrected? It was women. So her question was a trap you couldn't get out of. If women were chosen to deliver the most important news in all of Christianity, how on earth could you justify telling them to be silent now?
Now, the Quakers didn't just talk a good game about equality, they actually built it into the system. They set up separate business meetings just for women. And this wasn't to push them aside, quite the opposite. It was to empower them. In these meetings, women learned how to run organizations, how to handle finances, how to speak publicly, and here's the kicker, they had the final say on all marriages. That gave them real power to stop women from being forced into a marriage they didn't want. And you know what? The skills these women learned in their meetings didn't just stay within the church. Oh no, they exploded onto the national stage. Women like Lucretia Mott took all that organizing experience and became absolute leaders in the fight against slavery and, this is so important, the movement for women's right to vote. In fact, Mott was one of the main organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So you can literally draw a straight line from the fight for a woman's right to speak in church to the fight for a woman's right to vote. But when it came to applying that same idea of equality to the issue of race, well, that turned out to be a much, much harder and more painful struggle for the Quakers. It's a story that's filled with incredible courage, but also, let's be honest, some really deep hypocrisy. And this road to justice was just so long. Get this, the very first Quaker protest against slavery in America was way back in 1688. But the leadership at the time, many of whom were making money from slavery, they basically just buried the whole thing. It took another 88 years of painful arguments and radical protests before they finally banned their members from owning slaves. And a huge reason they finally did make that change was because of this guy, Benjamin Lay. He was this radical activist who absolutely refused to be ignored. He saw the blatant hypocrisy of his fellow Quakers owning people, and he used these, well, theatrical, in-your-face protests to shame them into action. His most famous stunt was pure theater. It was incredible.
He walks into this big meeting of Quaker elders. Remember, a lot of them are slaveholders. He gives this fiery speech about the wrath of God, and then he throws off his coat and he's wearing a military uniform. And then, for the climax, he pulls out a sword and plunges it into a Bible. But inside the Bible, he'd hidden a bladder full of red pokeberry juice. It splatters this fake blood all over the shocked, slave-owning elders. I mean, wow, that is a message you just can't ignore.
And that legacy, that fight for racial justice, it kept going. Fast forward more than a century, and you have another Quaker, Bayard Rustin. This man was the brilliant strategist, the main architect behind the 1963 March on Washington. He's the one who taught Martin Luther King Jr. about nonviolent resistance, creating this direct link between old Quaker principles and the modern civil rights movement.
So, after centuries of fighting for women's rights and racial justice, you'd think the path forward would be pretty clear, right? Well, here's the irony. In our modern times, that very same core idea of equality has actually become the thing that divides Quakers the most.
So, the big question is, do all Quakers agree on this stuff today? The short answer is not at all. Especially when it comes to LGBTQ+ inclusion, the Quaker world is seriously divided.
And this whole debate really kicked off back in 1963 with yet another groundbreaking pamphlet. Remember, this was a time when being gay was still illegal, and this group of British Quakers put out a paper arguing that what makes a relationship moral isn't the gender of the partners, it's the quality of the relationship. Is it loving? Is it faithful? That was an absolutely revolutionary thing to say back then. And this really shows you where things stand today. The debate has basically split Quakers into different camps. On one side, you've got the liberal groups. They lean on that idea of the inward light and are fully affirming of LGBTQ+ people. But on the other side, you have evangelical groups who really prioritize the authority of the Bible and are non-affirming. And then, stuck in the middle, you have these big global groups that are just torn apart by it, creating a lot of tension, especially between members in America and Africa.
And today, that exact same split, that same theological fault line, is defining the debate over transgender inclusion. For liberal Quakers, affirming trans people is just the next logical step of their belief in equality. But for many evangelical Quakers, their interpretation of Scripture leads them to a view that gender is fixed at birth.
So, even with all these divisions, this idea of equality it's nowhere near done. That little seed that was planted 350 years ago, it's still growing, and it's branching out in some new and pretty unexpected ways.
Today, you see Quakers taking that core idea of the inward light and applying it to whole new areas. They're not just talking about anti-racism anymore. They're talking about reparations for slavery. They're pushing for what they call eco-justice, arguing that climate change is an equality issue because it hurts the poor the most. And they're promoting right-sharing, which is this idea that helping other countries isn't charity. It's about a fair redistribution of the world's resources.
So that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If one simple idea, that there's a spark of the divine in every single one of us, was powerful enough to challenge kings, to help bring down slavery and to fight for the rights of women, what does that idea ask of us right now? What are the hierarchies in our world today that it's telling us we need to question?